And these rides we did, they were social rides, but they were serious social rides, because the owner of the mountain bike shop in Warrandyte was the former Australian cross-country champion. But there was one bloke in front who thought we were stopping, and I've hit this guy at about 75 kilometres per hour. Thankfully, Mark, I didn't break a bone, didn't hit my head. The bike was still all right, so it was a bit of a miracle. Just lost a lot of skin, and I do recall riding home with skin flapping off my forearm.
G'day everyone, and welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makowiecki, and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Luke McCormack. Luke is the National President of the National Civic Council, and he resides in Brisbane, Australia. Luke, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, Mark. Really good to be here.
So Luke, I mentioned you live in Queensland, but you aren't originally from there, so I was hoping you could tell us a little bit of where you grew up.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I have now lived in Queensland 23 years, so that almost makes me a Queenslander. But originally grew up in a little town called Warrandyte. This is east of Melbourne by half an hour or so. And it was a beautiful spot to grow up. So thanks, Mum and Dad. It was right beside the Yarra River. You'd swim in the river 4 months during the year perhaps and fish. So that was fun growing up. And it was one of those little towns where they first found gold. And in fact, I think they claim gold was found there before, out west, Bendigo, Ballarat. So as a teenager, like going through gold mines was a real thing, including trying to climb the air shafts, which is pretty treacherous. Thankfully, I don't recall any injuries myself, but we got stuck in a few spots. And had a great time growing up in Warrandyte and caught the bus out to a big regional co-ed Catholic school and then went to uni and, would bus out from there until I realised it'd be better to live in the city. That's how I rolled out there. Grew up going to church and bushwalks and mountain biking I noticed I've picked a place to raise my kids in Brisbane that's probably a little bit similar, and I think that's what I did, perhaps unconsciously, wanted my kids to be raised in an area where there's lots of green space and a forest to go and walk through.
Yeah, one of our previous guests, Alan Harrelson, he has the same philosophy. He says that wherever we live, it should be as if the green space is God's hug around us. And so you and I both, I think, we've looked for those areas. So, Luke, you're also a keen mountain bike rider. So could you tell us what you like about it, and have there been any hair-raising moments during your life?
Oh, yeah, it's a great sport. Been riding since I was probably in year 10, so I'm going for, like 30 years, I think, over 30 years. So that's mainly been cross-country riding with a bit of racing. Did some cross-country racing, some downhill racing in the early days. The university used to have mountain bike races between universities. That was good fun. But it's just it's a fun pastime. Makes you feel young again, I think cycling generally does that. I've done a bit of road cycling as well, which is really good for commuting, usually. But, mountain biking, so lots of spills and offs. So thankfully, I've only ever broken one bone, and I've unfortunately driven over 3 hours to get to this spot and broke a finger in the first 15 minutes. So that was annoying. But the biggest off was as a young bloke going downhill at the end of a ride. And these rides we did, they were social rides, but they were serious social rides, because the owner of the mountain bike shop in Warrandyte was the former Australian cross-country champion. And he was basically trying to train us to be champions. And so they were pretty intense. And we're flying down this hill at the end, in a peloton, even though we're on mountain bikes. And you have your head tucked in and we're going for it, but there was one bloke in front who thought we were stopping, and I've hit this guy at about 75 kilometres per hour. Ouch. So the guy behind me, there's only one bloke, and he said, yeah, your body went up, Luke, and then it went down, hit the ground, and then it bounced back up again, and it down and bounced. And thankfully, Mark, I didn't break a bone, didn't hit my head. The bike was still all right, so it was a bit of a miracle. Just lost a lot of skin, and I do recall riding home with skin flapping off my forearm.
And was that just a Band-Aid or a stitch or a skin graft?
Turned out just healed up, didn't need a skin graft, but it was definitely distracting and entertaining when I'm sitting in university lectures for the next 6 months watching that thing heal up.
Luke, you also like to brew beer, which is a bit of an art and a science. So I was wondering, what are the advantages of making your own beer, and what's the key to a successful result?
Well, the key advantage is it's cheap. And if you like a few beers, and I like a few beers, sitting in the sunshine drinking a beer is, a thing for me. It's really cheap, but then you get to mould this beer to your liking. It's amazing. So I learnt from a friend how to brew from grain, because in the past I've tried it with a friend using a kit. It's faster, not necessarily cheaper, but the flavour's nowhere near as good. So if you start with grains, it's going to take you a 6-7 hour process, but it's fun. You get great flavours. You can create a beer that's as good to taste as something from the big end of town. And then, of course, you get to play with hops, and that's where things get a bit tricky, because, if you experiment too far, you might create too much bitterness or not enough, or sometimes if you've left them in there too long, you get a grassy aroma. To make a good batch, you need to concentrate and prepare yourself so that, you don't miss any steps. And particularly, obviously, at the very end, the most frustrating bit, Mark, is just trying to get it to cool down at the end so that you can put your yeast in. And that's the vulnerable bit, when it's at a temperature where other wild yeasts could grow and get in there before you've put your yeast in there. So you've got to keep it covered, but you've got to somehow cool it down, which is not easy to do. So the end is a bit frustrating. So you wouldn't want to have too many home brews yourself too early in that process.
So, Luke, as the national president of the National Civic Council, which is also known as the movement for historical reasons, can you tell us more about its history and objectives?
Yeah, sure, mate. It's the overall outcome it wants is a strong, fair, independent Australia. One that isn't bullied by other nations or doesn't feel like it's bound in trade to only one other country. You want to have flexibility, independence. And the movement has always achieved this in the most democratic, peaceful way, and that is through civic involvement. So we help build, form, inform, sustain communities, organisations at various levels. So we get people involved. So they could be from a trade union through to a professional association, even your local club, even your church or your worshipping community, getting involved for the common good. And of course, using key principles to guide us. So the dignity of the human person, the dignity and primacy of the family unit, which is, when you think about what the natural family does, it's amazing when it's functioning well. When a family's dysfunctional, it really hurts, and someone has to step in and it costs money. The third principle is for the common good. So we're working towards the common good of the group, of the nation. So learning to make some sacrifices and put effort in for the good of the whole. So what's good for the country? What's good for my state? What's good for my local community? Another key principle we use is decentralisation or subsidiarity, which is really about keeping decision-making power as to the lowest level, or the local level, as much as possible. And so you don't give the federal government something that state governments could do for themselves, for example. And the fifth one is really the virtues, so that we promote virtue, which is the glue that holds society together. And we can thank the West's success, if you like, in fairly just, stable society to those virtues, people practicing them without even perhaps realising it. Trust, for example, is pretty high in this country. That didn't come from nowhere. So some countries don't have trust. They have suspicion and corruption. So there you go. And so this way we organise is sort of democratic. It's multi-layered, and we analyse the issues and publish them in News Weekly. So News Weekly has been our flagship publication and been going since 1941. The first few editions were called Freedom. At its height, it was being distributed at 50,000 copies a year. So that's at newsweekly.com.au. Highly encourage your listeners to check it out. Take out a digital or print subscription. But we also train young people, get involved in university groups.
I'll put a link in the description for those who want to check more out about News Weekly and the work of the NCC. So just look below if you are interested. So you've been active for 16 years now in the movement, and you've seen a lot of campaigns. Could you tell us about the things you've been involved in?
Yeah, happy to. I think at first, initially, I had my heartstrings pulled on the life issue, the issue around abortion. So my very first involvement in a campaign was trying to oppose the rather extreme laws that Labor in Victoria were putting through the Parliament in 2008. And yeah, that was disturbing because of how extreme the laws were and the fact that the bill passed. And it's a very sensitive issue. So many women coerced, pushed by boyfriend, spouse, even mother, even grandmother, and life circumstances. And they think abortion is the solution out, and it would sort of feel like that for them quite often. And yet we know from women that various charities work with that this is not that simple. And so that was the first issue, and that was a hard one to deal with. But various campaigns, so everything from a development bank. Now, you might ask, what's a development bank? Well, the country was sort of built on them. They're government-run banks that you use to fund your infrastructure. And the advantage of a development bank is that the loan for the project, which could be a 10, 20-year project, could be very expensive, isn't on the government's books, It's on the bank's books. So think about the way infrastructure projects are currently set up. Someone has to borrow money, usually it's foreign money, and using private companies to get something done. That's good, but if the government feels there's an important piece of infrastructure it needs done for the purposes of the common good of the country or the state, it can do that. And the common way to do that would be through its own bank. And I believe that we need them back again. Germany still has its development bank that it had started post-World War II, still using it today. Only a few years back, Ireland actually had set up a development bank. Other issues, fair pricing for farmers. It's a big issue, still is today. When the Howard government dismantled the single selling desk for wheat because there was some corruption, that was a big mistake. Deal with the corruption. But the single selling desk for wheat was fantastic for our wheat farmers. Just the hedge fund alone to deal with foreign exchange rate changes saved wheat farmers in Australia many, many millions of dollars. So we have this lot of campaigns that are around the consequences of deregulating the financial system and offering too little protection to Australian producers and farmers who end up having to compete against the world rather than us helping them group together to compete strongly and adequately in a competitive way with the world in trade. So, other issues. Working with the Family Association, we were developing policies and encouraging policies that would strengthen marriages, because most divorces are avoidable and unwanted. And there's actually things the government could do to encourage people to stay together, right through to trying to prevent the redefinition of marriage. Seems like a long time ago, Mark, now, 2017. That was a long campaign and mainly built on misunderstanding, because marriage law was there not for adults but for kids. It's there to protect kids' rights and interests. It's actually there to limit the behaviour of adults. Yet now the new view, the yes view, really took an angle that marriage law was about validating romantic relationships, which it never was. So there's been a few losses and wins along the way, and I think Australia, is heading towards a time where some of our campaigning points will come back into view and into vogue, especially around the cost of energy at the moment, so the cost of electricity. We've been campaigning to try to have that reduced, because we consider it like a basic thing for life. You need cheap electricity, particularly if you want to have industry. If we want to stop losing jobs to overseas, you need industry to stay here or even come back here. And usually the fundamental part of that equation is cheap, reliable electricity supply. There's a few.
Would you say, in light of the fact that Australia's moving away from coal, whether we like it or not, that nuclear is an option that we should seriously consider?
Yes, and I reckon for two reasons. One is it's just a fantastic way to create energy. It's we've got so much thorium, and molten salt thorium reactors are very safe, and we could be the leader. And the second reason is that at the moment there's a lot of concern about carbon dioxide emissions, and you'd have very limited carbon dioxide emissions from running a nuclear power station. So if you want the stability, long-term reliability and stability, then it's nuclear, coal and hydro. And perhaps the renewables could play a small part like they have. And certainly having solar panels on someone's roof makes a fair bit of sense, but that does not run industry. Mm-hmm. And it's got other complicated issues, of course, with the grid. So, my view would be, nuclear is something we should seriously look at.
Mm-hmm. You've spoken about your passion for the family and having the government help rather than hinder it. And two particular aspects that you focus on are childcare, more flexible childcare, as well as improving the income tax system. So first of all, with the income tax system, could you tell us about what the problems are and what other countries are doing which we could learn from?
Yeah, so income tax at the moment in Australia, most people are paying that through pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you income tax. The problem with that is you are not considering who's enjoying or how the income is being distributed to other family members, which is to follow the principle of fair income tax and taxation in general. It's meant to be equal in equal circumstances. Yet for a family trust, which is used by people with perhaps a bit more wealth or, due to inheritance situations, family trust income tax is calculated after the distribution of the income to family members. And yet that's not followed for employees. So in other words, you're quite likely in many situations the government is effectively taking income off a family that it shouldn't have taken in the first place. And other countries have various ways of handling that problem. A few years back, I believe Senator Matt Canavan in Queensland had an important report tabled to Parliament where he counted, I think, more than 12 or 14 OECD countries that use some type of family income tax system. So you could take like an extreme case in parts of India where it's a household tax. So you could have multi-generations living in that house, aunts and uncles, extended family, all operating as an economic unit and therefore taxed in the same way, which makes sense. Because when you consider like the natural labour exchange that would go on, the care and cooking and cleaning, it's all part of a group, that we're not individuals trying to run a business. It's a group trying to do a thing as a group. So you tax the group. It's the fairest, cleanest way to do it. Various countries in Europe would have an income tax system that would include the spouse and possibly one or more children, or they might give more of a tax offset for the first child, then maybe a little bit less on the second child, or there's variations. In the United States, I understand it's optional, but you can submit a joint income tax submission. Australia has none of that. So I'm thinking it'd be nice to see Australia try something, and they could try what the former Conservative government in Canada did going back, say, 10 years or so, was a limited income splitting arrangement. And this is a bit more sort of like a cautious way for a government to go if it was worried about the cost. And that is, you'd say limit perhaps to $30,000 how much one spouse could distribute their income to the other for income tax purposes. But even that would make a considerable difference, because we're not talking about just a few bickies here. For a lot of Australian families, this would make an $8,000 to $12,000 difference, and that's not small change.
No, it's an approach that was advocated for in an interview I did a little while back with Joe de Bruin, who was the National Secretary of the Shoppies Union and hence a big power broker in the Labor Party. So it's an idea that is around, but we just need a bit more impetus, I suppose, and some vested interests are removed before we can get there.
Yeah, I think there'll be a bit of resistance too from the Treasury Department. They've said before, that their entire system is built on taxing the individual, and it would all seem too hard for them to change it. But I disagree.
Yeah.
I think you just need firm resolution of a government, and the opposition would naturally come from the more radical feminists within the Labor Party, because their view is that you don't want too much economic interdependence between spouses, that the woman has to be strong, can't be relying at all, really, on a spouse's care and income in a way that might make her vulnerable. Now, there's some good reasons why you might feel that way, and yet practically most couples don't compete like that. They actually work together for the common good of their family. They both make sacrifices and share labour in a way that's genuinely good for their family. And that might mean at various phases, one's on no paid income, just unpaid work for the family, caring for children in the home. And that might work out really well for their family. So we need a system that's flexible, that can do that. So, a lot of mothers, including the decision my wife and I made, was you want to focus on the 0 to 3 years and try to be there for that child as much as possible.
Yeah.
Well, that means your employer misses out because you've got a different employer. It's the 2-year-old.
So, Luke, keeping with the subject of childcare, you've said that government policy is quite inflexible. Can you say why this is the case and what could be done better?
Yeah, so the childcare subsidies payments, which have changed in their name over the years, and in the 19 years of parenting that I've done so far, there's been a lot of changes, and unfortunately not many good ones. It's quite inflexible, like you stated. Now, the reason for that is really the success of the more radical feminists within the Labor Party over many years. And this dates back to the formation of the Women's Electoral Lobby. And you can read books about it, like Sisters in Suits is a good book to read if you want to realise just how successful they've been. But they've created policy that effectively means a woman's full-time career could be absolutely minimally interrupted. But but that only matches a few women's personalities anyway. So most mothers want flexibility. And so what they've created is a childcare arrangement that can only be cashed in on if you're using government-approved daycare or family care scenario. And if you're doing do-it-yourself care at home, there's pretty much no help for you. So when you give up an income to care for your own child, right, you've already taken a hit by giving up income, and you're giving the child, if you like, the optimum type of care because it's a known person. So it's a parent figure, or it could be a grandparent. That's helpful. It's a face and a voice the child knows. But you can be very attentive to that child. Now, I know quite a few people working in the daycare centres, and they know you can't be super attentive on the ratio they've got between the carer and the child. You can't be attentive to so many small little things because in the 0 to 3 developmental phase, the child really only wants at least just one person acknowledging their progress and the little things they do. If you've been a parent, you'd know that often there's this situation where they'll turn to look and they want to see, like catch eye with you because they've just done something interesting or that's impressive to themselves or that they're worried about. And your voice, your tone of voice, is all there. So the childcare payments do not do anything for the vast majority of child minding that occurs in this country. In fact, what it's done is it's shifted people from against their first preference, which would be to have more time with the kids and less time at paid work, and push them into paid work with less time for the kids. So it needs to be more flexible. In fact, it would be better just to be universal. So my suggestion, just have a childcare assistance payment that doesn't analyse who's doing the caring. Let the parents decide. And I think that would take the heat out of the childcare market, if you like, and calm the whole thing down. And you'd have a lot more happier, more relaxed parents who don't feel so coerced into more paid work than they actually wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, you say it's not what a lot of parents want, especially mothers. It's not what they want. And you've looked into the research in this. Can you briefly tell us a bit about that research, what it says?
Yeah, so that was a study of 4,500 parents in the UK by Christina O'Done in a study called What Women Want. And it discovered that most women want flexibility. So like 6 out of 10 wanted no government coercion either way because they knew that sometimes, some years, when their child's at a certain age, they just want to be the carer and be at home. Then at other times, they might be able to pick up some part-time work later and then pick up their full-time career at some other point. But they did not want the government sort of coercing them one way or the other. There was another group, about 3 out of 10, so 30%, that when their kids are young, didn't want to do any paid work, flat out. I'd much prefer just to be the carer, to spend those years with the kids. Turned out there was only 1 in 9 to 1 in 10 who had the view that they'd much prefer to be in their career, if you like, and not really at home much at all, minding young kids. Now, my experience of life is that's like it roughly matches personality typology distribution. So if you had a personality that was like that, you just, hopefully your spouse can help by minding the kids. So that, you don't find it too taxing. Because, let's just face it, it's very hard work with young kids, especially multiple young kids. If you've got several under the age of 5, it's pretty hectic. And even the most patient, best parents can struggle. And so some people's temperaments would struggle with it. Unfortunately, Mark, we've got in Australia policy set by ideological politicians that only matches that 1 in 9 type personality. Like they've got themselves in mind. Like they are the 1 in 9, and they've created all the policies for them and ignored most of Australian mothers. So yeah, it's a very interesting study. You can still look that one up, and it's quite revealing. They even interviewed the dads, and they had pretty much super close responses to the mothers. So the dads were not far off with their opinion.
So, with Australia's income tax and childcare policies disadvantaging single income families and therefore kind of boosting the sense of getting more taxpayers, men and women in the workforce, this presumably would have a negative impact on the birth rate. So, I was hoping you could tell us a bit about the situation of Australia's birth rate.
Yeah, so I first started looking at birth rates around the world going back about 12 years ago. It was working with the Australian Family Association. And yeah, admittedly, I was first shocked. I thought, surely this is not right. And then you keep checking various government departments around the world and United Nations databases. And yes, it's true that the entire planet, if you like, every country is struggling and has been struggling for at least sort of 50 years with low birth rates, with the only exception being in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, you've got to be careful with population. So the population can increase and the birth rate can be decreasing. That's obviously due to either immigration or aging. So once you've got your head around it, you start to realise that something is wrong. And the reason I say wrong, put it this way, worrisome. Now, there is low birth rates. A low birth rate would be considered anything under 2.1, because 2.1 is about your replacement level. And low fertility or birth rates is when you're approaching something like 1.5, 1.4, of which demographers in the world do not know of any culture or country that's ever recovered from a low birth rate. And the number of countries with a birth rate under 1.5 is alarming. So in Australia, we have had below replacement for about 50 years now. It went up a bit during the more generous, egalitarian Howard government era of baby bonuses. But when Labor introduced their more stringent sort of ideological policies, you saw that birth rate drop again. I think it might have got to up to 1.8, 1.9, maybe edging on 2, and then back down again. And then we saw even during COVID, so it went down further. So I think we might be around 1.6, 1.7. It's been shown that you'll get dips when there's financial difficulty. But it was, in fact, something I believe the Thomas More Centre even covered, that the data analyst from the UK, goes by the name of Shaw, produced a documentary called The Birth Gap. And the most interesting thing that came out of that analysis was that it's childlessness that significantly increased. Not so much that the size of families has decreased. So I had the view that it's mainly about people having a smaller family. And there might be a little bit of truth to that from country to country. And certainly they've shown that your accommodation affects you. So if you're locked into accommodation that's like a unit, you will actually probably have less kids. When you interview people about how many kids they wish they'd had versus how many they've got, on average in Australia, we have one less kid than we really wished, desired on average. But what Birth Gap showed was this childlessness has rapidly increased. So, for example, in Japan, I recall in the 70s, it might have been around 1 in 20. We've gone from like 1 in 20 to 1 in 4. So those sort of figures are pretty concerning. And this is not necessarily intentional childlessness. There'd be a little bit of intentional childlessness on the rise, but it's largely unwanted childlessness.
There was actually a similar study in Korea which found that if you could get a woman having a child early on, say in her earlier 20s, then although she might not have a necessarily bigger family, it would be typical that I guess a second or third would follow. And so the overcoming the childlessness is one of the key ingredients, I suppose, to overcoming
Yeah,
these
well,
things.
that's the way my thinking has changed. It's almost like if you can just get a couple to find each other, bond, marry, have baby number one, that's the biggest hurdle. Like, and to do that in your 20s if you can. I say that for biological reasons. Yeah? And yet, the environment in Australia right now is really, I've got courses and studies to do and a career to get and a huge um, uni debt, student loan debt. I've got to solve that before I could think about having a family. And I think that's an unfortunate way to think. Apart from the biological clock ticking away, it doesn't have to be that hard. And that's where I think Hungary have shown you can turn these figures around a bit if you have generous financial policies around roughly speaking, the 20-year-old uni student who are trying to form a family, have a baby, but still study and want to pursue a career. Well, be generous to that demographic. Make it easier for them so they're not stressed out by a student loan. So I think they've got a policy where the entire student loan can be forgiven after the birth of a third or a fourth child. It's fascinating. Got a funny feeling quite a few Aussie women and men would enjoy a policy like that.
I think the Hungarian government also offers to extend your house, if possible, with the addition of, I think, a third or a fourth child. I guess it's similar to the car seat economics, isn't it? When we brought in sedans and to have a fifth child or whatnot would incur the cost of a new car. That is a major disincentive. And likewise with the size of your home, if you've got a 2 or 3 bedroom house, you might feel quite limited in growing your family. So there are creative ways, let's say, around the world, which I suppose we could learn from.
Yeah, indeed. And I like the ones you just listed. That would have been nice.
Because I don't think it's been mentioned, but you're a father of 6, Luke. So a lot of these things could have come in really handy.
It would have. It's funny. When we were getting married, my wife and I, we both had a vision of about 4 kids in our mind. But we got to 4 kids and felt like we hadn't finished and we weren't sort of full. And so we're really excited to have baby number 5. And then not too long after that, baby number 6. And he's been an absolute delight to the family. Just so life-giving and funny and gorgeous. But anyway, the curious thing was we'd only had 2 kids, but we had this sense that we should buy a Toyota van, So we had this people mover early on for years, and it turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
We filled the van.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You got a van, and hey, it's there to be filled. So I think if the government's thought along these creative lines, when we're quite generous, giving people space, giving opportunity for expansion, people would rise to the task. Let's say that they would fill that vacuum. Who knows? Just something to think about. So, keeping with this discussion about house expansion and whatnot. High land prices and expensive houses have a lot to do, I would imagine, with contributing to the fertility decline. What barriers do single income families face in particular when it comes to home ownership?
Yeah, so land prices in Australia are inflated, possibly the most around the world. I understand a recent comparison of annual median wages versus the price of a unit. We were, I think, a bit higher than Hong Kong, or perhaps just below Hong Kong. And Sydney and Melbourne driving that, and Brisbane wouldn't be far away. So, yeah, it's definitely a problem. And it's mainly the land price, not so much the house that's on it. So there's a few issues there. So obviously the obstacle for a family is the price. and then you've got to juggle then your priorities as a family. How are you going to divide up time and income? And if you've got children, who's going to care for the kids? But the background issue here is we are heavily centralised population. So we have like 80% of Australia's population in capital cities. In the United States, it's the opposite. 20% in large capital cities, 80% in the regions, in rural, small little cities. So if Australia has a few problems with land, one of them is we're all trying to live in the same spot. And clearly, land release by councils and the charges they put on them is a factor. But I think we're definitely due for a financial incentive to have jobs moved, businesses moved to smaller towns and cities, like you could offer them tax breaks, so that families could move to smaller towns and cities where the land and house is more affordable, your commuting times and family life is probably easier, this sort of thing. Now, I understand we're a small population with only, 26, 27 million people on an enormous continent, but that doesn't mean we couldn't be instigating a policy like that. I think that would take the pressure off. Of course, the other big thing is that immigration numbers, they've always been pretty high. The current Labor government made them very high. And I don't think that's very fair, allowing such high numbers if you haven't built the houses. Because you're just sort of punishing everyone. Everyone takes the heat. So I think that's reasonably irresponsible. And of course, one of the reasons for immigration is our low birth rate. You need a workforce. You need skilled labour. If we're not having the babies ourselves who are moving into those careers, you need to find them from somewhere.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of issues. I think ever since many years ago, banks were allowed to loan a mortgage based on 2 incomes rather than 1. That sets up the situation we have where you can he's trying to service that mortgage on 2 incomes. So who's minding the kid while you're doing that? And that means you can borrow more, means you can bid more on a house, inflates house prices. So if we had a more humane policy here that sort of took the heat out of it, there'd be quite a few things you'd have to do. And I feel sorry for people because your house is just a basic human right. Unless you make improvements on the block, you're not really, the inflated land price hasn't really done anything for the economy. It's only when you provide a good or a service or do an improvement that you've added something of value. So, in other words, I think it's a bit of it's a false market.
Yeah.
It's a propped up market.
I think when you mention about how the banks could assess 2 incomes rather than 1 and how that's inflated prices is quite tragic. The 2 income trap, where if you want to be a single income family, you're now competing against a much higher set of wages for the same property. So it's this capitalist plot. Really, it's not. It hasn't led to a greater sense of happiness or freedom within the populations, and so I think it should be revisited. But then the thing is, well, how can you get out of this now?
Yeah, great point. I think it'll be slowly. My advice to young people, young couples, is really consider moving outside a capital city for a start. And don't be afraid to buy small, simple, old. Your first home is unlikely to be your forever home. It's more often a stepping stone. And so don't start small. Start where you can and try not to put too much pressure on yourself with a mortgage that's too high. Maybe, look, I know it sounds funny, but like living with mum and dad, like if you can build a granny flat and build a unit, it's good when families stay close to each other. I also know it's challenging, but the data shows it's very good for our mental health to stay reasonably close to family support.
And you can also call on mum and dad sometimes for childcare, which is a great benefit too. So sticking with the movement to regional areas, but I was wondering what your opinion was on high-speed rail. And also, you touched upon it before, more with regard to private business. But what about public sector relocation to the regions?
Yeah, two good examples. So various times in the National Civic Council, it's popped up in conferences we've run at a state level, federal level, and in News Weekly magazine to support things like relocating a public service to a smaller town. As a very simple way, government can decentralise population and improve the lives of the people that work there. And that takes place to some extent. I know there's a fair bit of government service run out of Tasmania, which was secured in a deal like that. But you do have to put the pressure on, so government has to usually push the point. And various politicians have promoted it at times. High-speed rail, in terms of improving our decentralised population, well, high-speed rail helps to make that happen. So it's a great infrastructure project. And again, there's a lot of big projects like more dam building that we need to do, and it would be probably easier and we'd get more done if we had a government-backed bank to do it. But yeah, so high-speed rail would be a tick for connecting smaller towns and cities.
So, Luke, we mentioned you're married with 6 children and you work within the not-for-profit sector. So do you have any advice for how people can do things on a budget? And are there any inspirations that have helped you and your family through navigating hard economic times?
Well, that's a good question. We've raised 6 kids. Well, the youngest is only 3.5, so lot to go. But we've managed to do that largely on one single income, and our focus, like our shared values. So my advice is find a shared core values with your spouse and don't budge on them. And one of ours was wanting to be with our young kids, like have us around or a family member to mind them and not to rely on outsourced care with strangers. And we've been able to do that. It's very satisfying, and I've seen the benefit, like the emotional stability that you sort of get from that situation. But other advice, trust God. God's rich. He has ways of providing. I never regret sort of coming back to my faith as a 19-year-old again, and I just feel it's such a rich blessing. God's so generous. And he provides, it seems to me, in just the most simple, practical ways. So op shops are great, Mark. Don't buy anything new, or if you're going to buy something new, it should be, focused. Like I buy shoes new and maybe a bed, maybe, but not a car. And most of the furniture, we've always bought has been second-hand or given or donated or. Tear up your credit cards. Don't. If you need a loan, go to a friend or a family member for a short loan, but don't go to these huge banks who are willing to charge you ridiculous interest if you can't keep up the repayments. So that was a very good early decision to do that. Yeah, they're the main points. I think you have to be willing for a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of sacrifice, and maybe you can't keep up with other people with the holidays they go on. But there is a view, I think, where it creeps into people's minds that once I get more money, once I'm richer, then I can be happy and have fun. I'm like, do not think that way. You can have fun every day, and you can have fun moments with your kids, simple holidays or whatever, on a weekly, monthly basis. Don't let money concerns get in the way of you taking a moment to relax and having fun. So I think if you can do that, not only will your marriage stick together, but the family will as well.
Yeah. You mentioned op shops, and I remember back in the day growing up in Adelaide that to go to an op shop was a humiliating experience. But then there was something that happened maybe 20 years ago, and then it became trendy, and it's remained trendy. And we've seen the proliferation of St. Vincent de Paul's and Salvos and and whatnot. So it's become a thing. And if you're not doing it already, if you're still buying your clothes from shops new, you're crazy, because the quality of the stuff that you find and the price you can get it at is incomparable. And it also means that you won't look like someone else at a party, because it's unlikely that they're wearing the latest fashion. So there's the plug for the op shops. So Luke, just finally, we've had a little plug for the NCC. If you want to give it another one, by all means do, and then we'll wrap this thing up.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, look, if you're interested in politics just even a little bit, want to get more informed about what's going on, I encourage you to check out the National Civic Council and its magazine News Weekly, because we take the long view, and the broad view. So we look at things in depth. We're not just there to attack someone. In fact, we oppose and find ways to limit the damage done by extremes, by the extreme right or left. And so it's about a holistic vision. So if that interests you, come and check us out at ncc.org.au.
And just a plug for the Thomas More Centre. We have our YouTube channel, and liking, sharing, and subscribing to our content would greatly help us. We also have a website, tmc.org.au, and there you can sign up for our weekly newsletters written by our Executive Director, Anna Crone. They've become quite the thing. And so if you want to read something that's extremely well written, extremely informative, and free, please head on over there and sign up, and then you can be in touch with the events that we run all throughout, especially the east coast of Australia. But we're also looking to expand to other hubs around the country, and especially in regional areas, as we were saying before. So Luke McCormack, President of the National Civic Council, joining us from Brisbane, Australia. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.